Hello everyone. Today I'm going to be talking about an author named Viktor Frankl and the philosophical school of thought known as nihilism. I was inspired to give this talk by a comment I received from Janice, aka hiwayshoes, and I liked her comment so much that I wanted to first share it and then talk a little bit about it because I think she brings up some really interesting points, some interesting food for thought, and I think it could be helpful for all of us to explore some of these ideas. Frankl's entire life work is a solid detour off the headlong path towards nihilism. Not that I'm suggesting existentialism takes us there, but Frankl made it his mission to create actionable steps for one's own action in the world, showing that meaning can be made and held even in the worst of circumstances. I will be eagerly awaiting your study on him, and I think what might be an interesting idea would be to specifically contrast his work with the philosophical concept of nihilism. If nihilism is our path forward, and I've seen a lot on that lately, then what truly is the point? My take is that nihilism is a completely reactionary way to live one's life, a relinquishing of creativity. I think that what breeds nihilism is indeed the essence of nihilism. It is utterly useless for an agent in the world to fight nihilism with even more nihilism. So first, I want to thank Janice for this comment and also for her support over the last few months. She's one of the viewers that I've had the pleasure of chatting with a little bit in the comments on some of these other videos, and that's been really supportive, so thank you. I think there is a particular discourse around the idea of life's meaning, which is very prevalent and very popular today, which has really latched on to certain specific variants of existentialism while sidelining others. What's interesting about that is Viktor Frankl is often grouped in with other existentialists whose particular line of thought I'm not exactly sure really matches up with his. For instance, I think it's a pretty popular interpretation that the central message of man's search for meaning is basically that meaning is something we create, more or less arbitrarily, and that the purpose of creating this meaning is principally to foster happiness, to foster a sense of fulfillment, in other words, to make us feel better, to help us cope with the pains of life. I think it is understandable why people take that from Frankl's work. However, when we examine his thought more closely, I think it becomes clear that that's almost the opposite of what he is saying. Existentialism could be understood as kind of a spectrum, with thinkers like Sartre and Nietzsche and Camus who hold that there is no objective value or meaning or purpose to human life. And then on the other hand, you have guys like Kierkegaard who don't seem to really fit in with those guys because he seems to understand meaning as having some sense of objectivity. Frankl, I believe, is probably closer to Kierkegaard than, say, Camus. I wouldn't say that Frankl goes as far as Kierkegaard does to specify, more or less, a specific, singular, objective meaning to life. However, the idea of meaning being objective rather than purely subjective and purely something that we arbitrarily choose, basically pick whatever you want, I really don't think that describes Frankl's thought at all. This is most clearly expressed in what I think is maybe the central concept of Viktor Frankl's thought, which is a concept he calls the will to meaning. He talks about this in the Logotherapy in a Nutshell section of Man's Search for Meaning. And he describes the will to meaning as our primary motivator. It's supposed to explain all human behavior. And we should understand that this phrase is chosen very deliberately by Frankl. The will to something is not a concept that Frankl himself invented. In fact, there are two other major lines of thought which hold that the will to something, i.e. the main driving force of all human activity, is not meaning, but in the case of Freud, pleasure, or in the case of Nietzsche, power. So you have the will to pleasure from Sigmund Freud, who says that everything that humans do is to feel good. You have the will to power in Friedrich Nietzsche. Everything that we do, we're trying to basically screw each other over, get over one another, gain some kind of sense of security, some kind of control over other people, over nature, over the world, etc. Now, Frankl, of course, does not deny that people seek pleasure and power. Of course they do. But he does not think that either of these desires is primary. Frankl argues that, in fact, and this is kind of scandalous for Frankl to be saying this in his day, in his fields, actually, people who are consumed with the pursuit of pleasure or power are actually compensating for the lack of meaning in their lives. What he's doing there, if you're familiar with Freud's work, is he's inverting the idea of sublimation. He's saying that rather than people sublimating their will to pleasure in the pursuit of, say, something transcendent or something that is maybe spiritual, Frankl says actually the people who are over concerned with pleasure and controlling other people, those people are actually the ones that are compensating for something that they lack. And that thing, Frankl believed, was a sense of meaning. Now, it is true that Frankl advocated for certain specific things that we can, quote unquote, choose to find meaning in. Some of those things are love, work, and suffering. For example, there are instances where Frankl is practicing his therapy with a real-life client, and they're coming to him with really terrible situations that they're having a hard time dealing with. There is one example that is cited in a book by Mark D. Kellens called Personality Theory in a Cultural Context. I'll link that below. It's available free online. Kellens notes this one example in Frankl's practice where a patient comes to him whose wife has died and he's having a really hard time coping with that. And Frankl suggests that, I know this really hurts right now, but think of it like this. Imagine how much suffering your wife would have gone through if you had died before her. She probably would have gone through as much suffering as you're going through now. So Frankl suggested that this patient of his look at his life, which he's now surviving his wife who's passed. He says to look at his life as a kind of sacrifice to his deceased wife. By continuing to live and continuing to bear the responsibility for mourning her passing, this man's suffering, Frankl says, is converted into a kind of sacrifice. When we read passages like that, it's very tempting to think that Frankl is actually suggesting that meaning is not objective, that it's something you just choose, whatever makes sense, whatever makes you feel good. Pick one and run with it, basically. But is that really an accurate description of Frankl's thought? Let's return to his concept of the will to meaning, which we know is something primary. The will to meaning comes before the will to pleasure, for example. So to suggest that meaning or the desire for meaning is a kind of coping mechanism or defense mechanism, that it is something that we do primarily in order to avoid uncomfortable feelings or experience more pleasant feelings, that seems to contradict the idea that meaning is primary. Why? Well, if the reason that we're searching for meaning is to, for example, experience happiness or to have access to some kind of coping skill, well, then that means that meaning is a means to an end, the end being happiness, coping, etc. So it wouldn't be primary. And for all I know, maybe that's true. Maybe that is correct. Whether it is or not, though, it's certainly not what Viktor Frankl himself thought. Second of all, Viktor Frankl specifically targets a particularly mechanistic conception of the human being and the human condition that was very prevalent in his day in the field of psychology. And it was certainly inherited from Freud, who was, philosophically speaking, a materialist. He was an atheist. The idea of anything spiritual or transcendental, Freud would classify that as a defense mechanism, a way to cope with our mortality. Basically, it's a fantasy. It's an illusion, not real. One of my favorite quotes from Viktor Frankl, it's a particularly satirical one, if you can really appreciate what he's going up against when he's saying this. He says, I would not be willing to live or die for my defense mechanisms. I would not be willing to live or die for my reaction formations. From a philosophically materialist standpoint, that's all our thoughts are. That's all our behavior is. It's mechanistic, reactionary, not proactive, and certainly not something that is very meaningful. So to suggest that the search for meaning is itself a defense mechanism, I think that is essentially anathema to what Frankl believed. Now let's return to the example that we looked at from Kellen's book, where he cites an instance in Frankl's practice where he suggests that his patient adopt an attitude of, I'm making a sacrifice. Where does this idea of a sacrifice come from in the first place? In order for that suggestion to have any meaning or relevance for this patient of Frankl's, he has to understand what a sacrifice is. A sacrifice must be something that is understood to be noble, worthwhile, transcendent, meaningful. If that weren't the case, or at the very least, if that patient did not think that were the case, then this suggestion would be meaningless. It would be like telling someone who doesn't believe in God to suggest when something bad happens, well, maybe it's just God's will. Well, if the person doesn't believe in God, that's kind of meaningless to them. That's one of the great things about Frankl's work, is that it understands meaning to be both objective and subjective. To give you an analogy, consider the phenomenon of a mirage. You know, you have somebody that's wandering around in the desert. They're thirsty. They've been wandering around for days, perhaps, and they hallucinate a body of water in front of them because they're thirsty. That's what they're projecting onto the world. Obviously, being a mirage, it's not real. But does that mean that there are no bodies of water anywhere in the world? Of course not. It just means that this one particular instance is a hallucination. In fact, if there weren't any bodies of water in the world, you could argue that there would be no content for this hypothetical person to project onto the scene in the first place, because we can only work with what we've got, right? And that brings me to the final point I want to make, which we could extend more broadly to the discourse around existentialism that's popular today, where I think there's a very sharp dichotomy being carved between the objectivity of meaning and the subjectivity of meaning, between the idea that either there is an objective meaning to life and we are compelled to follow it, or there's no objective meaning to life and we can basically do whatever. I don't think that's really the dichotomy that actually exists. I think that's a false dilemma. I don't think it's true that if there is an objective meaning to life, that we would be compelled to follow it. I see no reason to believe that. I see no actual connection between those two ideas. But that's something that I think a lot of people latch onto with existentialism. I don't necessarily think that existentialists themselves advocate for that, but I do think that it's understandable that people would take that from, say, Sartre. Sartre says existence precedes essence. We are free and responsible. No objective meaning to life. You are responsible for choosing your meaning. See, the thing is, though, even if there is an objective meaning to life, there are existentialists, Frankl included, Kierkegaard included, who would say you're still responsible, because suppose there is something you're supposed to be doing. It doesn't entail that you necessarily will. There can be an objective meaning that we can refuse. There can be an objective meaning that we misinterpret. So what I think Viktor Frankl offers that's unique is he offers a conception of meaning that retains the idea of personal responsibility for choosing to interpret one's life in a meaningful way, because that's not always easy. But he also retains this idea that meaning itself is something real. It's something that actually does exist. Again, who's to say whether that's right or not? I don't know. I don't have access to the Akashic records or anything like that, so I have no idea. I could be wrong, Frankl could be wrong, who knows? My main point I think I wanted to illuminate here was that whether he's right or not, that is what Frankl believes. Frankl is not someone who thinks meaning is something that is chosen willy-nilly, arbitrarily, do whatever you feel like. And I think this is the most important part. He does not think that the search for meaning is merely a means to an end. That's very important to keep in mind. Why? Well, precisely because the search for meaning doesn't always end up making us feel happy. At least not in the sense that most people would understand happiness. What do I mean by that? Well, that's going to have to be saved for another talk, but I can give you a little preview. Next time we meet and talk about Viktor Frankl, I want to look at a particular section of man's search for meaning, where Frankl makes a sacrifice of his own. One that, first of all, seems to defy logic and reason, and yet on the other hand, in his own words, grants him access to what he calls a inner peace that he's never felt before. When we look at that section, I think it'll become more clear how it's possible for something to not necessarily lead to happiness, like jumping for joy kind of happiness, but to actually lead to something that is better, something that actually transcends happiness, something that might even transcend the body. Something that one philosopher, Aristotle, used to call eudaimonia, something that is notoriously difficult to translate into English. But in any case, we'll look at that next time. Again, I really want to thank Janice for this comment. It's been a while since I've uploaded anything. School's been busy and work, etc. And I went for a walk today and ended up realizing, I just need to buckle down and do this talk because it's something that I'm really passionate about. I love Viktor Frankl. I've had his book for a long time. It's accompanied me to some very dark places, some metaphorically and some literally dark places in my life. And maybe in a later video, maybe I'll talk a little bit about what the book personally means to me. And again, anyone else who's watching, feel free to drop a comment below and let me know what you think about Viktor Frankl and nihilism. Let me know if there's anything that you're looking to learn more about, and we'll see what we can do. And in the future, as I talk more about Frankl's work, definitely feel free to talk about how his work has impacted you, because that's ultimately the aim here. The aim is to put these ideas into practice. And when it comes to existentialists, Kierkegaard's probably my favorite philosopher, but when it comes to actually practicing existentialist philosophy in real life, come on, you can't beat Viktor Frankl. You just can't be done. Anyway, thanks a lot and take care.